The dust had not yet settled on the road into Caldwell, Kansas, when Dorothy Shelton pulled back on the reins and brought the rented buckboard to a hard, rattling stop. Her knuckles whitened around the leather straps. Her jaw was set like iron. And there, standing at the edge of the road, where the open prairie gave way to the first fence post of the Donovan cattle operation, was Frank Donovan himself, broad-shouldered and sun-darkened, his hat pushed back on his head as though he had been waiting long enough that he had forgotten the formality of looking sharp about it. She had not expected him to be the first face she would see. She had braced herself for a dozen other confrontations. She had rehearsed 100 different speeches in the cramped train compartment from St. Louis, her lips moving silently while other passengers slept, and the dark Kansas plain rolled past the windows in an endless black tide. She had imagined facing Mayor Aldrich and his wife, who had called her a thief in front of the whole congregation. She had imagined facing Preacher Holcomb, who had read her name from the pulpit like it was a curse word. She had even imagined facing the locked doors of the bank that had turned her away when she needed it most, when the ground was still fresh over her father's grave, and her mother was coughing blood into a handkerchief. She had not imagined Frank Donovan standing at the road with his arms crossed and his green eyes fixed on her like he had known the exact moment she would arrive. The betrayal of that moment hit her like a second branding iron, because it was Frank Donovan's silence 3 years ago that had sealed her fate in this town. It was his failure to speak up, his decision to stay quiet when Mayor Aldrich's accusations echoed through the packed church, that had allowed the entire machinery of Caldwell's cruelty to roll over her without friction. He had stood in the third pew from the front and he had said nothing. And Dorothy had looked straight at him with everything she had left in her eyes, and he had looked down at his boots. She was 26 years old now. She was no longer the desperate, grief-wrecked girl who had been run out of this town with nothing but a carpet bag and a shattered name. She had rebuilt herself in St. Louis with the stubbornness of someone who had nothing left to lose and therefore could not be beaten. She had clerked for a lawyer. She had learned to read contracts. She had saved every dollar she could scrape together. And when the letter had come from old Mabel Greer, her mother's childhood friend, explaining that Dorothy's mother had died in the Caldwell poorhouse and left behind a small property deed that the town had been quietly trying to absorb, Dorothy had bought a train ticket the same afternoon. She was here for justice. She was here to claim what belonged to her family. She was not here for Frank Donovan. But Frank Donovan was here anyway, and he was walking toward her buckboard with the slow, deliberate stride of a man who had made up his mind about something, and intended to say it out loud regardless of the consequences. "Dorothy," he said, and the single word carried across the distance between them like a stone dropped into still water. She did not answer him. She clicked the horse forward and the buckboard lurched ahead, and she drove straight past him on the road without so much as turning her head, because turning her head would have cost her something she was not prepared to spend. Not yet, not on him. But she felt his eyes follow her all the way to the edge of town, and the feeling sat in her chest like something unfinished and dangerous, like a match that had been struck but had not yet found its purpose. 3 years earlier, Dorothy Shelton had come to Caldwell, Kansas as a young woman of 23 with her father freshly buried and her mother gravely ill, and a secret that only she and one other person in the world had known. That secret was the reason she had gone to Frank Donovan in the first place, before everything collapsed. Her father, Elias Shelton, had been a good man and a poor planner. He had borrowed money from the First Caldwell Bank under the co-signature of Mayor Gerald Aldrich, who had been a family friend since before Dorothy was born. The loan was to expand the Shelton homestead, to sink a second well, to build a proper barn. Elias had worked the land faithfully, and the land had cooperated in the good years. But the dry years of the late 1870s had been merciless, and by the time Elias Shelton died of a fever in the spring of 1881, the note at the bank was considerably overdue. Mayor Aldrich had come to Dorothy and her mother within a week of the funeral. He had come with his hat in his hand and his eyes full of what looked like compassion. But Dorothy had grown up watching men negotiate, and she knew the difference between compassion and strategy. He had explained in the kindest possible tone that the bank was owed what it was owed, and that because he had co-signed the loan, his own reputation was at risk if the debt went unpaid, and therefore he would like to propose an arrangement. The Shelton property, 12 good acres with water rights that the town had been eyeing since the railroad came through, would transfer to the mayor's holding company at a price that was, Dorothy calculated rapidly, and with sinking horror, less than a third of its actual value. In exchange, the debt would be forgiven and the Sheltons would receive a modest cash payment. Dorothy had asked for time. She had asked for a week to consider. Mayor Aldrich had given her 3 days, and the unmistakable impression that the 3 days were a courtesy, not a negotiation. It was Frank Donovan she had gone to, because Frank Donovan was the only man in Caldwell she trusted, and the only man in Caldwell who had both the financial resources and the personal integrity to possibly help her. Frank ran the largest cattle operation in the county. He had known her family for years. He had ridden out to help her father with fence repairs twice without being asked. And if she was being completely honest with herself, in the private interior of a young woman's heart that she guarded very carefully, she had trusted Frank Donovan with more than just her practical judgment. She had trusted him with a portion of something tender and unspoken that had been growing quietly between them for the better part of 2 years. She had gone to his ranch house in the early evening, which was already a breach of propriety in 1881 Caldwell, Kansas. She had explained the situation with the deed, the debt, the mayor's offer, and what she believed the land was actually worth. She had proposed that Frank Donovan purchase the land at fair market value, which would pay off the bank note and leave her mother with enough to live on, with the understanding that Dorothy would work to repurchase the land in installments once her circumstances stabilized. Frank had listened to all of it. He had been sitting across from her at his kitchen table with a kerosene lantern between them, and the light had played across his face and she had watched him think, watched him weigh it, and she had genuinely believed that he was going to say yes. He had said he needed to talk to Mayor Aldrich first. Dorothy had felt the first cold finger of dread at that, but she had told herself it was reasonable. He was a businessman. He wanted to understand all the angles. She had thanked him and gone home and waited. 2 days later, on a Sunday morning when the whole of Caldwell was gathered in the First Methodist Church, Mayor Aldrich had stood up during the announcements portion of the service and declared that Dorothy Shelton had been approaching prominent men of the community with a fraudulent land scheme, attempting to misrepresent the value of encumbered property in order to extract money under false pretenses. The word fraud had landed in the church like a thunderclap. Dorothy had been sitting in her customary pew with her sick mother beside her. She had felt the word physically, like a blow to the sternum. She had looked around the church and seen face after face turning toward her with the particular expression that people wear when they are relieved that someone else is the one being devoured. And she had looked at Frank Donovan in the third pew, and he had been staring at his boots. She had never learned exactly what Frank had said to the mayor, or what the mayor had said to Frank, or how the conversation had unfolded. She knew only that the information she had shared in confidence with Frank Donovan had been the foundation of the mayor's accusation. There was no other possible source. Only Frank had known the details. Only Frank had heard her describe the land's value and her plan, and Frank had chosen to speak to the mayor before speaking to her. Whether it was cowardice or calculation or something more complicated, the effect had been the same. Dorothy Shelton had been shamed in front of her entire community. Her mother had wept silently beside her. The preacher had included the situation in his sermon the following Sunday as a cautionary example. No one in town would extend Dorothy credit or employment. The bank, operating under Mayor Aldrich's shadow, had called the note immediately and seized the property at their own valuation. Dorothy had left Caldwell 6 weeks later with her mother bundled into a wagon, no money, a destroyed reputation, and a particular quality of rage that burned cold rather than hot. The kind that does not flare and die but instead settles into the bones and becomes a permanent feature of the interior landscape. She had placed her mother with Mabel Greer in a neighboring town until she could establish herself. She had gone to St. Louis. She had worked. She had saved. She had learned. Her mother had died 18 months ago, peacefully, with Mabel holding her hand, and the small property she had left was a parcel that Dorothy had not known existed, a strip of land adjacent to the original Shelton homestead that had been in her mother's family name rather than her father's, and therefore had not been caught in the bank's seizure. It was not large. It was not particularly valuable on its own. But it shared a western boundary with the Shelton homestead that the mayor's holding company had absorbed, and according to the lawyer Dorothy had consulted in St. Louis, there was a legitimate question about whether the boundary survey done at the time of the original seizure had been accurate. If it had not been, then a portion of the transferred land might actually still belong to Dorothy's mother's estate, and therefore to Dorothy. It was not a certain case. It was a possible case, but it was enough. It was enough to justify coming back to Caldwell, Kansas, to face the town that had shamed her, to claim what was rightfully hers, and to look every person who had participated in her humiliation directly in the eyes with the full weight of what she had become in the 3 years since they had discarded her. She had not planned on Frank Donovan standing at the road. The town itself had not changed much. Caldwell in the spring of 1884 was still a cattle town at the edge of its glory, the great drives up from Texas still rumbling through, but the days of the big herds already beginning to feel numbered as the railheads shifted and the barbed wire crept westward. The main street had the same dry goods store, the same hotel with its peeling sign, the same barber and the same saloon and the same church standing at the north end of the road like a disapproving elder. There were a few new buildings. The telegraph office had expanded. There was a second lawyer in town now, which told Dorothy something about how much business had grown and also how many disputes there were to settle. She booked a room at the Caldwell Hotel under her own name because she would not hide. The woman at the front desk, a younger woman Dorothy did not recognize, accepted the $2 deposit without any visible reaction, which was either a good sign or a sign that the younger generation simply did not know who Dorothy Shelton was. Both possibilities felt simultaneously deflating and freeing. She ate supper alone in the hotel dining room. She noticed people noticing her. An older woman in a dark dress whispered to her companion. A man who had been one of her father's acquaintances looked at her from the doorway and then chose a different table. Dorothy ate her stew and her bread without acknowledgement and kept her eyes on her plate with the practiced composure of someone who had been stared at before and survived it. She was finishing her coffee when the chair across the table from her was pulled back and someone sat down in it without invitation. She looked up. Frank Donovan had removed his hat. He held it in both hands, turning it slowly, and his green eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that she recognized and did not want to recognize. "I know you do not want to hear from me," he said, without preamble and without softening. "I am not asking for anything. I just need to say something, and I need you to let me say it before you decide what you are going to do while you are in this town." Dorothy set down her coffee cup with the deliberate steadiness of a woman who had very carefully decided not to throw it at his head. "You have 30 seconds, she said. He did not waste any of them. What I did 3 years ago was wrong. I went to Aldrich because I was afraid of what he would do to my operation if I moved against him without warning, and I told myself that I was being smart, that I was protecting myself in order to eventually be able to help you from a better position, and every word of that was a lie that I told myself to avoid the truth, which is that I was a coward. I watched what happened to you in that church, and I have not had a single quiet night's sleep since." The restaurant was very still. The woman in the dark dress had stopped whispering. Dorothy was aware of being watched, and she was also aware that for the first time in 3 years, the cold, burning thing in her chest had shifted slightly, like a stone moved by running water. "3 years of lost sleep does not give me back 3 years of my life," she said. "No," he agreed. "It does not. Nothing gives you that back. I am not offering you an exchange. I am offering you the truth, and I am offering you whatever help I can give you while you are here, with no expectation of anything in return." "Why?" she asked, and the single word came out sharper than she intended, because the genuine answer to that question was the thing she was most afraid to hear. Frank looked at her for a long, steady moment. "Because you came back," he said, "and because the fact that you came back, after everything this town did to you, is the bravest thing I have ever witnessed in my life, and because I owe you a debt I cannot repay, but I intend to try." Dorothy looked at him across the small table with its checked cloth and its salt cellar and its single-lit candle, and she felt something very complicated move through her like weather. She had come back to Caldwell with a plan, a legal plan, a practical plan that did not include Frank Donovan at all. She had sealed off the part of herself that had once felt something tender and dangerous in his direction, sealed it as carefully as a jar of preserves that you stored in the cold cellar and did not open because you were not certain whether what was inside had kept or had gone bad. "I have a lawyer," she said. "I do not need your help." "I know," he said. He stood up and replaced his hat. "But the offer stands. Good evening, Miss Shelton." He walked out of the restaurant, and the normal sounds of the room gradually reassembled themselves around his absence, and Dorothy sat with her cooling coffee and the uncomfortable awareness that her plan, which had been very clean and very clear that morning on the train, had already developed its first complication. The next morning she went to see the second lawyer in Caldwell, a man named Prescott who had come up from Wichita 2 years prior, and who, crucially, had no prior relationship with Mayor Aldrich that she knew of. He was a thin, careful man in his early 40s with a precise mustache and a very organized desk, and he listened to her explain the situation with the property survey and the boundary question and her mother's estate with the attentive, professionally neutral expression of a man who was already calculating billable hours. When she finished, he tapped the desk twice with one finger. "The survey question is legitimate," he said. "If the original survey was inaccurate, and if we can demonstrate that, then there is a real argument that anywhere from 2 to 4 acres of what the holding company currently controls should properly be part of your mother's estate and therefore yours. The problem is that the holding company is controlled by Mayor Aldrich, who controls the town council who appoints the judges in this jurisdiction. Getting a fair hearing in this courthouse would be like trying to plant corn in a fire pit." "What are the options?" Dorothy asked. "We could file for a change of venue to the federal circuit. Takes time, takes money." Prescott looked at her carefully. "And in the meantime, there is nothing to stop Mayor Aldrich from making your stay in Caldwell rather unpleasant." "He has already done his worst to me," Dorothy said. Prescott looked at her in the way that experienced men look at people who have suffered, and who believe the suffering is finished when in fact it is merely in a new phase. "Miss Shelton," he said gently, "Gerald Aldrich has been building his power in this town for 15 years. He has expanded since you left. He controls the bank, 2 of the 3 major grazing leases in the county, and the main freight contract. He is not a man who takes challenges to his holdings lightly." Dorothy felt the familiar cold fire settle more solidly into her. "File the papers," she said. "Change of venue, federal circuit, whatever it takes. I have money." She put enough cash on his desk to retain him, and then some, money she had saved in hard increments over 3 years of deliberate, purposeful work, and Prescott looked at the bills and then at her face, and then nodded slowly with the expression of a man who has decided that this particular client is going to be interesting. By afternoon, the news that Dorothy Shelton had retained a lawyer and was filing against Mayor Aldrich's holding company had completed its circuit of the town. Dorothy knew this because she could see it in the particular quality of attention she received when she walked down the main street to buy stamps at the post office. Not all the attention was hostile. Several people looked at her with something closer to cautious speculation, the way people look when someone is doing a thing they have wanted to do themselves but lacked the nerve for. An older man named Coppersmith, who had run the feed store when Dorothy's father was alive, stopped her on the sidewalk. He had aged considerably. His hand shook slightly when he touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Shelton," he said, and his voice was low and not unkind. "You want to be careful. Aldrich has been after the Donovan water rights for 2 years. Man like that, you put him under pressure. He is liable to start applying pressure of his own in every direction he can reach." "I appreciate the warning, Mr. Coppersmith," she said, and she meant it. "Your daddy was a good man," Coppersmith said, and walked on without another word, and Dorothy stood still for a moment on the sidewalk and breathed through the tightness in her chest that his simple declaration produced, because kindness, after long absence, has a way of undoing the very armor that was built to withstand cruelty. She walked to the edge of town that afternoon, to the property that had been her family's. Someone had painted the barn. The second well had been sunk, the one her father had borrowed to pay for. The house itself looked inhabited, and there was a washing line with a family's clothes pinned to it, which meant Aldrich had either sold or leased the place to actual settlers, which somehow made the whole thing worse and better simultaneously. Worse because the evidence of other lives being lived in her family's space was a particular kind of grief, and better because it meant the land was not simply sitting there as a trophy. She stood at the fence line and looked at it for a long time, and she made herself feel every bit of what she was feeling instead of sealing it away, because she had learned that what you seal away does not disappear. It simply waits, and it charges interest. She was walking back toward town when she heard hoofbeats behind her, and she turned to find Frank Donovan on a large bay horse, slowing to a walk to fall in beside her. "You do not have to walk," he said. "I can have a horse sent to the hotel for you while you are in Caldwell." "I like walking," she said. He dismounted anyway and walked his horse beside her, which was such a specific form of stubbornly considerate behavior that she almost smiled at it and then did not. "Coppersmith spoke to me today," he said. "He told me Aldrich had his clerk pull the records on your mother's estate this morning, an hour after Prescott filed your papers." Dorothy felt the hair on the back of her neck rise. "That was fast." "Aldrich has a system," Frank said. "He hears things almost before they happen. I have been dealing with him for 2 years over my water rights. The man does not wait for problems to come to him. He engineers situations before they can threaten him." "What does he do with the records?" Dorothy asked. "Looks for leverage," Frank said. "Anything he can use. Any irregularity, any unpaid tax, any technical error in a filing, anything that lets him delay or discredit or disqualify before a dispute even gets to a hearing." Dorothy thought about this in silence for a moment, the evening light coming at a long, flat angle across the plains and turning everything a deep amber gold that she had genuinely missed in St. Louis without fully knowing she was missing it. The sky in Caldwell was enormous. It had always been enormous. St. Louis had buildings that interrupted it. Here there was nothing between a person and the full arc of the sky from horizon to horizon, and Dorothy had forgotten until this moment how that felt, the peculiar combination of exposure and freedom that came from standing under a sky with no ceiling. "Why does he want your water rights?" she asked. Frank was quiet for a moment, walking his horse with the easy habit of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors. "Because without my water, 3 of the smaller ranching operations to the east of me cannot sustain their herds through a dry summer. They either sell to Aldrich or they fold. With my water they have options. Without it, he consolidates. He has been buying up property and grazing rights for 5 years. He is building something that is essentially a land monopoly in this county, and the only operations he has not been able to touch are mine and a couple of smaller outfits who have been smart enough to file with the Federal Land Office." Dorothy looked at him sideways, the warm light catching the line of his jaw, the honest tiredness around his eyes. "You have been fighting him," she said, "and it was not quite an accusation and not quite an acknowledgement. It was something in between. Trying to," he said, "badly so far. He is better at the game than I am. I am a cattleman, not a lawyer." Dorothy stopped walking. Frank stopped beside her, and the horse stopped too, with the patient good sense of an animal that has been well treated and trusts the person holding its lead. The amber light was very bright, and the wind was coming in from the south with the soft green smell of spring grass. "You should have told me," Dorothy said, and the words came out quietly but with a weight that had been building for 3 years. 3 years ago. "You should have told me what you were afraid of, what you were calculating, what Aldrich had over you. You should have talked to me, not to him." "Yes," Frank said. There was no excuse in his voice, no self-defense. Just the single, unadorned word of a man who had reached the point of carrying something long enough that he was no longer interested in putting it down gently. "I was trying to save my mother's life," Dorothy said, and her voice did not break, but the edges of it went rough. "That was what the land was. It was not a scheme. It was my mother's life." "I know," he said. "I have known that since the morning after I talked to Aldrich, when I understood what I had actually done and could not undo it. Dorothy, I have known it every day since." She looked at him for a long time in the evening light, this man who had made the wrong choice and knew it and had apparently spent 3 years in the custody of that knowledge. She was not ready to forgive him. She was nowhere near ready. But she found, standing there on the road outside the town that had shamed her, that she was able to acknowledge that the situation had been more complicated than she had allowed it to be in her careful, protective reconstruction of it. Frank Donovan was not a villain. He was a man who had been afraid and had chosen badly and had been living in the consequences. That was not exoneration, but it was a truth, and she had come back to Caldwell in pursuit of truths. "Good night, Frank," she said, and she walked back to town without looking behind her, and this time she did not feel his eyes on her back but rather something else, something quieter and more uncertain, like the beginning of a question she did not yet know how to ask. 3 days passed in a rhythm of careful activity. Dorothy met twice more with Prescott, who had found something interesting in the county's survey records. The original survey of the Shelton property had been conducted in 1876 by a county surveyor who, it turned out, had also been employed by Mayor Aldrich's holding company in a private capacity during the same period. This was not illegal, but it was a conflict of interest that had never been disclosed, and in the context of a federal circuit challenge, it was exactly the kind of procedural irregularity that could allow a judge to order a new independent survey. Prescott was quietly excited about this in the restrained way that lawyers become excited, which is to say his mustache twitched slightly faster than usual when he explained it. Dorothy felt the first genuine bloom of hope since she had arrived, a cautious, conditional thing but real. On the 4th morning she came down to breakfast at the hotel and found a letter under her door. It was unsigned. It contained a single sentence in a neat clerk's hand, obviously not the author's own writing, because the words were too crude for anyone with that quality of penmanship. The sentence said, "Women who cause trouble in this town have historically found it very difficult to leave safely." Dorothy read it twice. She folded it and put it in her bag and ate her breakfast with complete attention to the taste of the eggs and the coffee, because she had decided before she came back to Caldwell that she would not let Gerald Aldrich make her feel afraid in the way she had felt afraid 3 years ago. She was afraid, but the fear was now a different kind, the kind that sharpens rather than paralyses. She went directly from breakfast to Prescott's office and showed him the letter. He looked at it carefully and then looked at her with his professionally neutral expression and said, "This is actually useful. Threatening a party in a legal dispute is not something a federal circuit judge looks kindly upon." "May I keep this?" She let him keep it. She was crossing the street from Prescott's office when she almost walked directly into Frank Donovan, who was coming the other direction at a pace that suggested he was looking for her. He stopped. She stopped. The street was busy with morning activity, wagons and horses, and the general purposeful noise of a working cattle town. "Aldrich called in alone on the Cattleman operation this morning," Frank said, without greeting. 12 hours after Prescott filed for change of venue. "Cattleman is one of the small ranchers I was telling you about. He has been using my water access. Now he is going to have to sell." Dorothy understood immediately. "He is making an example. He is sending a message," Frank said, "to me, to Prescott, to everyone watching. This is what happens when you assist Dorothy Shelton." The cold fire in her chest flared. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it. "I did not intend to put your neighbors in difficulty." "It is not your fault," Frank said, with a conviction that was clearly not a polite formulation. "Aldrich has been looking for a reason to move on Cattleman for a year. Your lawsuit gave him a convenient cover for the timing, but he would have found another reason in another month. Cattleman knows it too." "What will Cattleman do?" "Probably sell," Frank said. "He has a wife and 2 small children. A man in that position does not have the luxury of standing on principle when principle means his family goes without." Frank's voice had a particular quality when he said this, something layered and personal, and Dorothy filed it away without pressing on it. "Is there anything that can be done for him?" Frank looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "I have been thinking about that," he said. "I may be able to structure a private purchase arrangement that gives him working capital and keeps his family on the land. Takes me some of my operational reserves, but it can be done." Dorothy looked at this man on the busy street of Caldwell, Kansas, with the morning sun full on his face and the noise of the town all around them, and she felt the sealed jar in her interior shift again on its shelf, something inside it pressing against the lid with a warmth she was not prepared for. "You would do that?" she asked. "I am not doing it to impress you," he said, immediately and clearly, which meant it was exactly the kind of thing a man said when he knew he was in danger of it being interpreted as a maneuver. "Cattleman is my neighbor, and it is the right thing to do, and I am in a position to do it." "I know," Dorothy said softly, and the 2 words contained something she had not intended to let out. The days that followed had a texture that Dorothy had not anticipated. She had expected her return to Caldwell to be a clean, contained legal procedure, but instead it had the messy, living quality of actual human experience, which refused to stay within the lines she drew for it. Mabel Greer, her mother's old friend, came to the hotel to see her on the 5th day. Mabel was 71 and moved with the careful determination of someone whose joints no longer cooperated with her ambitions, but her mind was entirely intact and her memory was formidable. She sat across from Dorothy in the small hotel parlor and held her hands and looked at her with the thorough, evaluating kindness of someone who knew her mother's face and could see it in hers. "Your mother talked about this land constantly," Mabel said. "That strip along the western edge. It was her grandmother's land originally, came down through the women in the family. Your mother always said it was the one thing Gerald Aldrich could not have because he did not know it existed." She kept the deed in the lining of her winter coat. Dorothy felt something shift in her understanding. "She knew," she said. "She knew he was corrupt the moment he came to you with that offer after your father died," Mabel said. "She said she wished she had spoken up sooner, but she was too ill and too frightened. She told me that you had the strength to come back and fix it. She believed that absolutely." Dorothy's composure, which was considerable, showed one visible crack, a single moment where her expression moved through something private and enormous before it reassembled itself. "Did she suffer?" Dorothy asked. "At the end?" "No, my love," Mabel said. "She went quietly. She talked about your father, she talked about the house with the cottonwood tree, she talked about you." Mabel squeezed her hands. "She was proud, Dorothy, fiercely proud of what you made of yourself." After Mabel left, Dorothy sat alone in the hotel parlor for a long time and let herself grieve properly, the kind of grieving that she had been holding at bay with practicality and forward motion. And it was not pretty and it was not brief. But when it was done, there was something cleaner on the other side of it, like a field after rain. She had supper that evening at the hotel again, and Frank came again, but this time she did not give him 30 seconds. She said, "Sit down," and he sat, and she told him what Mabel had said about the deed in the coat lining, and the history of the western strip of land, and Frank listened to all of it with his full attention, the green eyes steady and the hands quiet on the table. "Does Prescott know the full history of the parcel?" he asked, when she was done. "I am going to tell him tomorrow," she said. "The provenance matters," Frank said. "If the land can be documented as belonging to the women's line of the family going back to your great-grandmother, then it was never part of your father's estate, and therefore never legitimately in the scope of the bank's seizure, regardless of any survey. It is a completely separate chain of title." Dorothy looked at him. "You understand land law. I have been studying it for 2 years trying to protect my water rights," he said, with a wry exhaustion that was oddly endearing. "I know more about Kansas land tenure than I ever wanted to." "Then help me understand the argument Prescott should be making," she said. And that was how they spent the next 2 hours, talking through the legal structure of the case in the corner of the hotel dining room, while the other diners gradually departed, and the candles burned lower, and the kitchen staff moved quietly around them. Frank knew things she did not know. She understood the documentary evidence in ways he did not. Together, between the two of them, the shape of a genuinely strong case began to emerge, cleaner and more powerful than either of them had separately constructed. At some point in the second hour, Dorothy noticed that she had stopped monitoring the distance between them with anxious precision, and had simply been talking, the way she used to talk with him before everything fell apart, with the ease of two people who think at similar speeds and find each other's thinking useful. It was alarming to notice this. She noticed it and then she let it be, because she was tired of spending energy on the maintenance of her own defenses when what she was defending against was not quite what she had originally believed it was. "Frank," she said, during a lull while he was looking at the notes she had made on a piece of hotel stationery, "what did Aldrich say to you 3 years ago, when you went to him?" He looked up from the paper. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding whether to have this conversation, and then deciding to have it. "He told me that you were using me," he said quietly. "That you had been building a relationship with me specifically because you knew about my finances, and you intended to leverage that into a deal that would benefit your family at my expense." He had details. He knew about conversations we had had, private conversations. He made it sound completely credible. Dorothy felt very cold and very clear. How did he know about those conversations? "I have wondered about that ever since," Frank said. "There was a ranch hand I let go that same winter. A man named Garrett. He had worked for Aldrich before he came to me. I think he was placed there." "Aldrich had a man in your operation," Dorothy said. "Almost certainly," Frank said. "Reporting things back, building a picture. And when you came to me with the land proposal, Aldrich already had everything he needed to make it look like a scheme. He handed it to me as though he was doing me a favor, warning me. And I was," he stopped, and the word he chose next was very careful, "I was afraid that it was true, that you had been cultivating me deliberately, because it would have been easier in some ways to believe that than to believe what I actually felt." The room was very quiet. Dorothy held very still. "What did you actually feel?" she asked, and the question came out much softer than she intended. Frank looked at her across the table in the low light with the complete, unguarded honesty of a man who had been carrying something for 3 years and had finally set it down in the right place. "That losing you from Caldwell was the worst thing that happened that spring," he said. "Worse than the business risk, worse than the political complication. That I had watched someone extraordinary walk out of my town because I was a coward, and that I would spend the rest of my life knowing I was the person who made that happen." The sealed jar in Dorothy's chest opened. She did not make a dramatic production of it. She simply felt it happen, the careful preservation she had maintained for 3 years releasing its pressure, and what was inside had not gone bad. It had changed, the way things that are kept carefully sometimes intensify rather than decay, deepening into something richer and more complex than what they were at the beginning. "I am not forgiving you tonight," she said, and her voice was steady. "I need more time than that. But I want you to know that I understand the situation differently now than I did when I arrived. And I am not saying that to give you something. I am saying it because it is true and I believe in saying true things." He nodded. There was something in his face that was not quite relief, but was in the family of it, tempered by the appropriate humility of someone who understands that they are not yet owed relief. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I am not going anywhere." 2 days later, Mayor Gerald Aldrich came to the hotel. Dorothy was aware of the stir before he arrived, the way the lobby quieted and people's bodies angled slightly away, the social current that moves through a room when power enters it. Aldrich was 60, heavier than she remembered, with the prosperous, deliberate bearing of a man who had been important for long enough that it had become his natural posture. He had the kind of face that wore respectability the way expensive fabric is worn, smoothly and with total conviction. He sat across from her in the hotel parlor without asking and said, in the most amiable possible tone, "Miss Shelton, welcome back to Caldwell. I understand you have been consulting with Mr. Prescott about some property matter." "You understand correctly," Dorothy said. She did not offer him anything, not a greeting, not a pleasantry, not the smallest social lubrication. Aldrich smiled with the practiced warmth of someone who had been smiling at people. He was simultaneously threatening for a very long time. "I wonder if there is a way to resolve this without the expense and delay of a federal proceeding. Litigation is hard on everyone. It is particularly hard on people who are in the wrong," Dorothy said. The warmth in his smile did not waver, which told her something about the quality of his nerve. "The original survey of your family's property was conducted correctly and in accordance with all applicable county procedures," he said. "Any challenge on those grounds would be very difficult to sustain." "The surveyor worked for your holding company," Dorothy said, "privately, during the same period, without disclosure." Something behind his eyes shifted. It was very small, barely visible, but it was there. He had not known she knew about that. "I also have documentation of the western parcel," Dorothy continued, "establishing its ownership through a separate maternal line going back to my great-grandmother, which means it was never part of my father's estate, which means the bank had no legal authority over it, which means your holding company's title to any portion of that parcel is defective. And I have a threatening letter that was delivered to my hotel room, which is going to make a federal circuit judge's opinion of this entire situation considerably less favorable to you." Aldrich was quiet for a long moment. The amiable smile was still on his face, but it had become purely mechanical, a habit of muscle rather than an expression of anything. "What do you want?" he asked finally, dropping the social pretense with the efficiency of someone for whom it was a tool rather than a principle. "I want what is mine," Dorothy said. "The western parcel, clear title, with all fees and taxes paid for the years it should have been under my mother's estate. I want the survey error on the main property acknowledged formally. And I want Cattleman's loan called back in at the original terms." "The Cattleman matter is a separate business arrangement," he said. "Not in my mind," Dorothy said. "And not in my lawyer's filing." Aldrich looked at her with the particular calculating attention of a man who is assessing whether a threat is real or performative. Dorothy sat very still and let him look, because the threat was entirely real and she had nothing to hide behind her eyes. "I will need to consult with my attorneys," he said. "You have 1 week," Dorothy said, "after which the federal filing proceeds and I give the threatening letter to Prescott to include in the evidentiary record." He stood, replaced his hat, and walked out of the hotel with the measured pace of a man who was not going to give her the satisfaction of seeing him hurry. but she noted that he was out the door 4 seconds faster than his normal deliberate pace would have suggested, and she considered that a small but real victory. She found Frank at his ranch that afternoon, in the corral working with a young horse, and she told him everything that had happened in the hotel parlor, and she watched the expressions move across his face with the transparent quality of a man who has given up on concealing his feelings, relief and admiration, and a very specific kind of satisfaction that comes from watching someone you love handle an impossible situation with complete competence. The word caught in her own interior. Someone you love. She tucked it away to examine later and kept talking. "He is going to look for a countermove," Frank said, leaning on the fence with the horse standing quietly behind him. "He will not simply accept your terms." "I know," Dorothy said. "What would you do if you were him?" Frank thought about this with the serious attention he gave to actual problems. He cannot challenge the maternal line documentation if it is solid. He cannot discredit the surveyor conflict of interest once it is in the federal record. So he would look for something procedural, a defect in your standing to file, a question about whether the estate has been properly probated. Dorothy felt something cold touch the back of her neck. "The estate? Have you filed the probate paperwork?" Frank asked. "Prescott filed it in Wichita," she said. "Standard process." "Is your name clearly established as the sole heir?" Dorothy thought carefully. "My mother had no will. I am her only child. It should be automatic." "In most cases, yes," Frank said. "But if he found someone to contest your heirship, even frivolously, he could delay the estate long enough to complicate your timeline." "Do you have a birth certificate? Any documentation of your relationship to your mother that could be quickly presented?" Dorothy thought. Birth records in rural Kansas in 1858 were not always meticulous. She had a baptism record. She had letters. She had Mabel Greer, who had known her mother since childhood. "Mabel Greer," she said immediately. "She would testify?" Frank asked. "She would testify and she would enjoy it," Dorothy said, and something in her voice that had not been there for a long time came back briefly, a lightness, almost a laugh. And Frank heard it, and the expression that crossed his face in response was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him yet. He sent a rider to Wichita that same evening with a letter to Prescott detailing the probate concern and the need for additional documentation support, and Dorothy stayed at the ranch that evening for supper, which was the first time she had been there since the initial terrible evening 3 years ago when she had come to him for help and set everything in motion. The ranch house was the same, which somehow surprised her. The same kitchen table with the kerosene lantern. The same solid chairs. The same window looking out over the open range, where the last of the daylight was painting the grass the color of embers. Frank's housekeeper, a stout and dignified woman named Mrs. Aldgate, who had been with the operation for a decade, made a supper of roasted beef and bread and potatoes, and after it was cleared away, she disappeared with the tact of someone who understood when two people needed to be alone in a room. They sat at the table with coffee, as they had that evening 3 years ago, and the lamp between them, and the difference from 3 years ago was substantial. Then they had been two people conducting a business conversation with the charged undercurrent of something unspoken between them. Now, they were two people who had said almost everything that needed to be said, and were sitting in the enormous, complicated space that those words had cleared. "Tell me what your life was like," Frank said. "In St. Louis, all of it." And Dorothy, who was not a person who spoke freely about herself and who had spent 3 years largely in the company of her own interior life, because the circumstances had not offered much else, found that she wanted to answer this question. She told him about the law clerk position, about the lawyer she had worked for, a fair-minded man named Drummond who had treated her as a colleague rather than a curiosity, about the boarding house on Olive Street where she had made 2 actual friends among the other boarders. She told him about learning to read contracts and what that had done to her understanding of how power operated through documents and language. She told him about the particular loneliness of living in a city where no one knew your history, which was also a freedom, but a freedom with a hollow center. Frank listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he had given to the legal problem earlier in the day, the focused, respectful attention of someone who understands that what they are being told matters. "Were you happy?" he asked, when she had been quiet for a moment. Dorothy considered the question honestly, because it was the kind of question that deserved honesty. "I was functional," she said. "I was growing, I was building something. I was not happy the way I had been happy before." She paused. "Before my father died, before everything changed, I had not been that kind of happy since." Frank was quiet for a moment. "What kind of happy was that?" "The kind where the future feels open," she said. "Where you wake up in the morning and the day feels like it could hold anything. Where you are not always calculating what might go wrong next." Frank looked at the lamp flame. "I have not felt that way in 3 years either," he said. "I kept thinking, when this is resolved, when the water right situation is settled, when I have secured the operation properly, then I will be able to think about the rest of it. But the truth is I was using the work the way some men use whiskey, to avoid thinking about the part that actually hurt." Dorothy looked at him across the lamp. "Which part was that?" He looked up from the flame and directly at her, and there was nothing evasive or managed about his expression. "The part where I made the worst decision of my life, and you walked out of Caldwell because of it," he said. "The part where I had been on the edge of saying something to you for 2 years, and then I had the chance, and instead I went to Aldrich and destroyed everything." "What were you going to say?" Dorothy asked, very quietly. The lamp flame moved in a draft from somewhere, throwing the light across them both in a shifting pattern, and Frank Donovan said, "That you were the most remarkable woman I had ever known, and that I wanted to ask you to let me court you properly, and that I was afraid because I had never felt that way about anyone, and afraid was apparently the dominant note in how I operated that winter." He said it plainly, without flourish, the way a man states a fact that has been true for long enough that the embarrassment of it has been worn smooth by time. "I am telling you now because you asked, and because I said I would be honest, and because I am not afraid anymore. Not of this." Dorothy was very still for a long, full moment, and the night outside the window was enormous and star-filled in the Kansas way that still astonished her no matter how many times she had seen it, and the lamp burned between them with its small and persistent warmth. "I am still not ready to say everything," she said, at last. "I still have things to work through in my own understanding. But I want you to know that I hear you, and that what you just said is not nothing. It is very much not nothing." Frank nodded, and the expression on his face was the careful, patient expression of a man who is genuinely willing to wait, not because he is passive, but because he has finally understood what is actually worth waiting for. She rode back to town in the borrowed buggy he lent her, under the enormous Kansas sky with its thick spray of stars, and she felt something that she recognized eventually, after considering it carefully, as the beginning of happiness. Not the arrived kind, the approaching kind. The kind that you can feel coming like weather, still some distance off but unmistakable in its intention. Aldrich made his countermove 4 days later. A man arrived from Wichita claiming to be a distant cousin of Dorothy's mother, a man named Harold Pryor, who filed a competing claim on the estate on the basis that he was also an heir. The claim was transparently manufactured. Mabel Greer had known Dorothy's mother since they were girls and had never once heard the name Harold Pryor. The man himself was visibly uncomfortable when Dorothy's lawyer Prescott questioned him, stumbling over basic biographical details about her mother's family that any genuine relative would have known. But the claim was enough to create a legal delay, which was its purpose. Dorothy absorbed this news with the controlled steadiness she had developed over 3 years, and then went directly to Frank's ranch, not because she needed rescuing, but because she wanted to think the problem through with someone whose mind she trusted, and Frank's mind was the one she trusted. They sat on the porch of the ranch house in the afternoon light, the wide prairie rolling away to the south, the cattle visible in the near distance as a dark moving mass, and Dorothy explained the prior situation in full. Frank listened and then said, "Prescott needs to depose him quickly. Get him on record with the biographical errors before Aldrich can coach him. The more specific the testimony, the harder it is to correct later." "Prescott is already moving on that," Dorothy said. "But there is something else." She had been thinking about this on the ride out. Aldrich spent money on this maneuver. He hired a man, paid his travel from Wichita, filed the papers. That means he is taking the case seriously. That means he is scared of losing. Frank looked at her with a slow, recognizing expression. "He would not spend that kind of money on a frivolous claim," he said. "If he was confident in his legal position, he would sit and wait." "Exactly," Dorothy said. "He knows the surveyor conflict is damaging. He knows the maternal line documentation is solid. He is trying to delay and exhaust. He is betting that I will run out of money or patience." "Will you?" Frank asked, not as a challenge but as a genuine question. "No," Dorothy said with complete certainty. Frank was quiet for a moment, looking at the prairie with the focused expression of someone forming a decision. "I want to make you an offer," he said. "And I want you to know before I make it that it has nothing to do with the property and everything to do with wanting this to be resolved correctly and completely. I want to fund the continuation of the legal case. Whatever Prescott needs, whatever the Federal Circuit costs, I can cover it." Dorothy looked at him. "That is a great deal of money." "Yes," he said. "I cannot accept that," she said. "You can," he said calmly. "Because it is not a gift. It is a loan, and Prescott can draw up the terms this week, reasonable interest, repayment from the property settlement when it comes. And because I am going to offer the same thing to Cattleman so that his family is not pressured into a sale. And because, frankly, defeating Aldrich in a Federal Circuit case benefits every small operation in this county, and I have been wanting to do it for 2 years, and this is my chance." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, looking at him. "You are maneuvering," she said, but there was no accusation in it. It was almost an observation of affection. "I am trying to do several right things at once," he said. "I have been told that is a reasonable approach." "By whom?" "By you," he said, with the first fully unguarded smile she had seen from him since she came back, and it transformed his face in a way that was entirely unfair, because it was the smile she remembered from before everything, the one that had been part of what she had filed away in the sealed jar for 3 years. She accepted the loan on the terms he described, and Prescott drew up the documentation that week, and the legal case moved forward with the additional resources. The deposition of Harold Pryor took place on a Tuesday in Prescott's office, and it was over in 40 minutes, because the man did not know what year Dorothy's mother had been born, did not know the town where she had grown up, did not know the maiden name of her mother's mother, and offered 3 different answers to the question of how he believed himself to be related to the family. He signed a withdrawal of his claim the next morning and was on the train back to Wichita by noon. Dorothy watched him go from the window of the hotel and felt, not triumph exactly, but the solid satisfaction of a just outcome. The Federal Circuit judge assigned to the case came from Topeka 3 weeks later, a man named Judge Hargrove, precise and weathered, and clearly not interested in local political considerations in the way that local judges were. He reviewed the documentation on the surveyor conflict of interest with visible distaste. He reviewed the maternal line chain of title for the western parcel with careful attention. He reviewed the threatening letter with no visible expression at all, which was its own form of eloquence. Gerald Aldrich's attorneys argued for 2 days. Prescott responded for 1.5, and the half-day felt more devastating than the 2, because the quality of Prescott's argument had the clean, sharp efficiency of a case built on genuine truth rather than constructed justification. Dorothy sat in the gallery throughout. On the second day, Frank sat beside her, which he had not done on the first day because he was giving her space, and she had come to understand this as a consistent and thoughtful pattern in how he operated, always giving her space, always staying available, never pressing. She did not tell him to sit somewhere else. Judge Hargrove issued his ruling in writing 2 days after the arguments concluded. He found the surveyor's conflict of interest material and sufficient to warrant a new independent survey of the main Shelton property boundaries, to be conducted by a surveyor of the court's choosing. He found the chain of title on the western parcel clear and established in favor of Dorothy Shelton's mother's estate, and therefore Dorothy Shelton as sole heir. He ordered the costs of the proceedings paid by the holding company. And in a separate notation, he referred the threatening letter to the federal marshal's office for review. Dorothy sat in Prescott's office and read the ruling twice, carefully, because she wanted to understand every word of what she had won before she allowed herself to feel the winning of it. Then she put the document down on Prescott's desk and she said, "Thank you," and Prescott's mustache moved in its particular way, and he said, "It was a genuine pleasure, Miss Shelton." She walked out of his office into the Caldwell afternoon, and the sky was the enormous clear blue of a Kansas spring day with white clouds moving fast and the smell of the range in the air. And Frank was waiting on the sidewalk because of course he was. Because he had been waiting at the road the first day, and he had been waiting every day since in his particular patient way. She looked at him, and she felt the last of the sealed jar dissolve entirely, all the careful preservation and all the controlled distance, and what was left without it was something that had been living and growing beneath the protection all along, warm and steady and entirely certain of itself. "We won," she said. "You won," he said. "I was just the financing." "You were considerably more than the financing," she said, and the words were quiet and specific and Frank heard every layer in them. He stepped off the sidewalk to where she was standing and he said, "Dorothy," and she said, "Yes," and the single syllable was an answer to more than just her name. He kissed her on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in full view of anyone who cared to look, and Dorothy let herself be kissed by him with the full, uncomplicated presence of someone who has stopped carrying a weight she was always meant to put down. Someone was watching from the window of the dry goods store. Someone was watching from the barber's doorway. Dorothy Shelton, who had been shamed before this entire town 3 years ago, was standing in the middle of their street being kissed by the most respected cattleman in the county, and she did not care even slightly what any of them thought, because she was beyond the reach of their judgment in every direction that mattered. The new independent survey of the main Shelton property, conducted 6 weeks later by a surveyor from the Federal Circuit, revealed that the original survey had indeed placed the property line approximately 2.5 acres short of its accurate boundary. That 2.5 acres, added to the western parcel already established as Dorothy's, gave her a total of nearly 5 acres of land in Caldwell County. It was not the whole of what her family had owned. The main homestead building and the better portion of the original property remained in the holding company's name, legitimately, that part of the seizure having been conducted in accordance with the law as written, even if not as fairly as it should have been. Dorothy had made her peace with that, because she had come back for justice, not for the full return of every lost thing, and justice had a different shape than vengeance. She had the western parcel and the 2.5 acres of the corrected survey boundary registered in her name within the month. The land itself was not yet usable for anything productive. It needed work. It needed water access, and water access meant cooperation with the neighboring properties, which in practical terms meant cooperation with Frank Donovan, whose operation was to the north. This was not a hardship. Frank proposed on a September evening, 2 months after the ruling, with the harvest moon coming up enormous and orange over the flat Kansas horizon, and the two of them standing on Dorothy's parcel in the particular silence of a piece of land that you have fought for and won, and are now beginning to understand as yours. He did not make a speech of it. He was not a man who made speeches. He said, "I want to spend the rest of my life with you, Dorothy. I know that is not a small thing to ask, and I know I have no standing on which to ask it except that I love you, and I have loved you for 3 years while you were gone, and I love you now in a way that I understand is not going to diminish with time but is going to grow. And I believe that you know how to love and how to build and how to fight for what matters. And I want all of that in my life for the rest of it, if you will let me." Dorothy looked at the moon coming up over the prairie, and she thought about her mother, who had loved her father steadily through everything including the hard years, and she thought about the 3 years in St. Louis, the functional years, the building years, the not quite happy years, and she thought about what it had felt like to drive back into Caldwell on the buckboard and see Frank Donovan standing at the road, and how even in the first shock of seeing him, even through the layer of old pain and old anger, there had been something in her that recognized him with the specific precision of recognition that has nothing to do with thought and everything to do with something more fundamental. "Yes," she said, and it was the same word she had said on the Caldwell sidewalk after the ruling, and it contained the same multiplicity of meanings, all of them true. He put a ring on her finger that had been his grandmother's, a simple gold band with a small garnet, and the moon rose and the prairie spread itself out in every direction under the growing dark, and Dorothy Shelton stood on her own land and felt the future open in front of her like the sky itself, enormous and full of possibility. They were married in November in the First Methodist Church of Caldwell, which was the same church in which Dorothy had been shamed, and which was now full of people who came with varying degrees of original guilt and genuine goodwill, and a general communal sense that the town was making something right that it had made wrong. Preacher Holcomb had retired the previous year. The new preacher was a younger man who knew Dorothy only as a woman returning to claim her inheritance and had no invested interest in the old story. Mabel Greer was there, in her best dress, crying cheerfully and making no effort to stop. Prescott was there, mustache and all, with his wife. Coopersmith from the feed store was there. The Cattleman family was there, their situation stabilized by Frank's private loan arrangement, which Aldrich had been compelled to honor at the original terms as part of the fallout from the federal ruling. There were other faces, too, people who had looked away 3 years ago and were now choosing to look at her directly, and Dorothy let them look, because she was not a person who required anyone's approval, but she was also not a person who was going to refuse a genuine reckoning. Gerald Aldrich had left Caldwell 2 weeks before the wedding. He had sold his holdings quietly and quickly, and the rumor was that the federal marshal's investigation of the threatening letter had expanded into a broader review of his land dealings, and rather than face what that review might produce, he had taken his remaining wealth and relocated to somewhere no one was specific about. The holding company's assets were being absorbed by the bank in receivership. Several of the properties he had accumulated were going to auction in the spring. Dorothy did not feel triumphant about his departure. She felt the settled, factual satisfaction of a situation resolving into its appropriate shape. He was not a tragic figure. He was a man who had built his power on other people's vulnerabilities and had met someone whose vulnerabilities had become her strengths, and the math had not worked in his favor. On the morning of the wedding, Dorothy stood in the small room off the side of the church that served as a vestibule, in a dress of dark blue wool that she had made in Wichita, which was the color of the sky at the particular hour before full dark when the blue is so deep it almost becomes something else. And Mabel Greer was fussing with her hair and crying, and Dorothy was not crying, but she was very close to it, which was itself a kind of triumph, because 3 years ago she had believed herself entirely beyond the reach of this kind of happiness. She thought about her mother. She thought about her father. She thought about the letter in the hotel room, and the church full of turned faces, and the train platform in St. Louis, where she had bought her ticket back with hands that did not shake, because she did not allow them to. She thought about Frank Donovan standing at the road. She walked down the aisle toward him, and he watched her come with those green eyes that had always been too honest. And when she reached him and took his hand, the whole of the complicated 3 years resolved itself into a single present moment that contained everything it needed to and nothing it did not. The ceremony was simple and it was real, and when it was over they walked out of the church into the November afternoon where the air had a clean cold edge to it, and the sky was the particular vast blue of a Kansas autumn, and the whole of Caldwell was arranged on either side of the church steps. Frank leaned down and said quietly against her hair, "We are going to build something extraordinary," and she looked up at him and said, "We already have." The winter of 1884 into 1885 was a good one. Not easy, because nothing in ranch life was ever easy, but good in the way that things are good when they are in their right shape. Dorothy moved into the ranch house, which was considerably larger and more comfortable than anything she had had access to in St. Louis, and she and Mrs. Aldgate negotiated a working arrangement with the pragmatic civility of two competent women who each had their established domain and were willing to respect the others. Dorothy began the work of developing her 5 acres in parallel with the ranch operation. She was not a woman who was going to sit decoratively in a ranch house while her husband ran things. She had plans for the land, a modest garden operation initially, with the longer view of eventually establishing a proper homestead on the parcel itself, something that would stand as evidence of what had been won and what it meant. She also, at Frank's suggestion, and then increasingly from her own professional enthusiasm, began helping with the legal and documentary side of the ranch operation. There was a great deal of it. Grazing leases, water right filings, cattle sales contracts, labor agreements. All of it benefited from someone who could read a contract with the eye of someone who had spent time in a law office and understood where the dangers hid in the language. Frank watched her work with the admiring attention of someone who is discovering that the person they love is even more extraordinary in practice than they had imagined in theory, which is the best kind of discovering. In March, when the spring was beginning to push up through the Kansas ground, and the cattle were restless with the energy of the new season, Dorothy told Frank that she was pregnant. He received this information sitting at the kitchen table with the morning coffee in front of him, and the expression that traveled across his face was one of the most completely open things she had ever seen from another human being, pure and undefended joy moving through him like weather. And she understood in that moment with absolute certainty that whatever she had built in the 3 years she was gone had been preparation for this, not punishment. Their son was born in November of 1885, on a clear cold evening when the stars were very bright, and Mrs. Aldgate was useful in ways that went well beyond housekeeping. They named him Elias, for Dorothy's father. He was born loud and with a full head of dark hair and opinions about everything from the first hour, which Dorothy said was a promising sign, and Frank said was terrifying. Mabel Greer came to see him at 3 weeks old and held him for a long time with the careful competence of a woman who had held many babies in her decades, and she said to Dorothy, very quietly, "Your mother would have been so completely undone by this." And Dorothy laughed, genuinely laughed, with the full warmth of someone who is no longer managing their grief, but living with it as a companion rather than a burden. The 5 acres of Dorothy's parcel began to take shape that second spring. Frank's ranch hands helped build a structure on it, a solid 2-room building of the kind that could be expanded, and Dorothy planted the garden with the systematic thoroughness she applied to everything she decided to do. The cottonwood that had been on the original Shelton homestead was not here. That tree was on the main property that she did not own, but she planted a young cottonwood on the western edge of her parcel in its honor, and she understood that she was planting it for Elias more than for herself, a thing that would grow as he grew and be substantial by the time he was old enough to sit in its shade, and wonder about the people who had preceded him. The spring auctions of Mayor Aldrich's former holdings drew buyers from across the county and beyond. Frank bought the Cattleman land at a fair price and sold it back to Cattleman on long terms, a transaction that produced in Cattleman a quality of grateful relief that made Dorothy simultaneously happy for the man and angry on behalf of every person Aldrich had pressured who had not been as fortunate as Cattleman in having someone able to intervene. The systemic injustice of the land consolidation Aldrich had been engineering was not undone by his departure. The smaller operations he had already absorbed were gone. Those families had scattered. Some things could not be fully corrected. Dorothy thought about this often. She thought about it with the particular quality of thought that looks at an injustice not to wallow in it, but to understand what might be done differently in the future. She wrote letters to the Federal Land Office in Topeka about the practices she had observed. She wrote a detailed account of the surveyor conflict of interest and sent it to a newspaper in Wichita. She understood that changing the conditions that made men like Aldrich possible was work that went beyond one legal case, and she intended to do what portion of it she could from the position she now occupied. Frank read her letters before she sent them and occasionally offered suggestions, and increasingly deferred entirely to her judgment, because he recognized that in this particular domain she was simply better than he was, and he had the secure self-knowledge to find that fact not diminishing but genuinely pleasing. The years settled into the rhythm that good lives develop. Elias grew from a loud, opinionated infant into a loud, opinionated small boy with Frank's green eyes and Dorothy's precise way of thinking, a combination that was going to be formidable once he was old enough to direct it anywhere. He learned to ride at 4. He was reading at 5, not because Dorothy forced him to, but because she had so many books in the house that it seemed to him a natural activity, something adults did, and therefore worth learning. He followed Frank around the ranch with a focused, worshipful attention that made Frank simultaneously proud and careful, aware of the particular responsibility of being the person your child most wants to become. Dorothy's garden operation expanded in the 3rd year into a genuine small enterprise, selling produce and preserved goods to the hotel and the dry goods store in Caldwell. It was not the scale of operation that changed the family's finances in any meaningful way. They were financially comfortable by the standards of the day through the ranch operation alone. But it was Dorothy's own, built by her own hands and her own decisions, and it was important to her that she remained a person who built things rather than only a person who lived in what someone else had built. She and Frank were happy in the way that people are happy when they have chosen each other deliberately, and are neither surprised by nor complacent about that choice. They argued because they were both people with strong minds and opinions and the energy to defend them. They argued about business decisions, about how to handle a difficult ranch hand, about whether to expand the cattle operation or diversify, about how much latitude to give Elias at 4, and then at 5, and then at 6, when he developed a fascination with the horse corral that made his mother's heart operate at a slightly elevated rate. The arguments were not frightening to either of them, because underneath them was the bedrock of two people who had made a genuine choice and knew it. In the evenings when Elias was in bed and the ranch was quiet, they sat together on the porch in good weather, or at the kitchen table in the winter, and they talked the way people talk who have genuinely chosen each other as the primary companion of their thinking life. About the cattle markets and the changing landscape of Kansas ranching as the great drives dwindled and the fenced range became more common. About the political situation in the state, which was always complicated and usually interesting. About Elias and what kind of man they hoped he would become. About the letters Dorothy wrote and the responses they sometimes generated, evidence of a conversation beginning somewhere in the larger world about land practices, and the ways that legal structures could be used to concentrate power at the expense of people who lacked the resources to fight back. 3 years after Elias was born, in the autumn of 1888, their daughter arrived. They named her Clara Margaret, the Margaret for Dorothy's mother, and she arrived with the same opinions about the world that her brother had had at birth, and a quantity of dark curly hair that was evidently genetic on the Shelton side. Elias received the news of a sister with philosophical acceptance, and then, within 2 weeks, developed the specific fierce protectiveness of an older sibling that would characterize his relationship with Clara for the rest of their shared childhood. Mabel Greer, who was now 75 and managing it with enormous dignity, and a cane she used with theatrical disdain, held Clara in the same careful, practiced arms that had held Elias and said, "Your mother would have been completely destroyed by all of this happiness." And Dorothy said, "Yes, she would have." And the grief and the joy were entirely together in her voice, not canceling each other but coexisting as they do for people who have learned to carry both. Caldwell itself continued to change around them. The great cattle trail days were genuinely ending by the late 1880s. The railheads had shifted, the drives were fewer, and the town that had oriented itself around the cattle trade was finding new shapes and purposes. Some businesses struggled. New ones came. The character of the place evolved in the way that frontier towns evolved when the frontier itself moved on, becoming something more settled, more complicated, with a longer memory and a more layered set of stories. Dorothy's story was one of those layers. People in Caldwell knew it, the version that they had witnessed and the version they had heard, and gradually over the years the two versions merged into something that was mostly true and entirely local. The story of a woman who had come back and stood her ground and won, and the man who had been waiting for her. People in small towns love stories about their own place, and this one had the particular satisfaction of a story about justice achieved and love found, which are among the most durable kinds of stories there are. The cottonwood on Dorothy's parcel grew. Slowly, as cottonwoods do in the beginning, and then with increasing confidence once it had established its roots. And by the time Elias was 7, it was providing genuine if modest shade. And he climbed it when Dorothy was not watching and probably when she was watching and pretending not to. One afternoon in the late summer, when Elias was 8 and Clara was almost 5, and the ranch was in the particular productive fullness of a good late summer, Dorothy took Elias to the parcel and sat with him under the growing cottonwood and told him the whole story. Not a child's version of it. The real version, with the mayor and the church and the shaming and the 3 years gone and the coming back. She told it as a woman tells a story that she has finally made peace with, which does not mean the peace is simple or complete, but that it has been earned through the full experience of everything that the story contains. Elias listened with the complete, serious attention he gave to things he understood were important, and when she was finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, with the precision that was entirely Dorothy's and the directness that was entirely his own, "Was Papa wrong to go to the mayor?" Dorothy looked at her son, who had Frank's green eyes and was going to grow up with a sense of fairness that she intended to foster as carefully as she could. "Yes," she said, "he was wrong, and he knew it and he carried it, and he did everything he could to make it right. That is a very important thing to understand, Elias. Being wrong is not the end of a person's story. What you do with the wrong is the story." Elias considered this with the gravity of an 8-year-old who is receiving information he intends to keep. "Did you forgive him?" Dorothy looked at the prairie beyond her land, and at the fence line that marked the boundary of what she had won, and at the cottonwood growing steadily above her. "Yes," she said, "a long time ago." That evening she told Frank about the conversation. They were sitting on the porch of the ranch house with the day's light leaving slowly in the way it does in Kansas, where the sun seems reluctant to commit to going entirely, and Frank listened to what his 8-year-old son had asked, and what Dorothy had answered, and the expression on his face was the unguarded one, the one that still appeared without warning even after years of marriage and was still startling in its completeness. "He is going to be difficult," Frank said, and his voice was entirely warm. "He is going to be wonderful," Dorothy said. "Those are often the same thing," Frank said, and she laughed and leaned her head against his shoulder and felt the evening come in around them, vast and quiet and theirs. Years later, when Elias was grown and Clara was not far behind him, and the ranch had expanded into a genuinely substantial operation, and Dorothy's parcel had become a small but productive homestead that she still spent real time on, because it was still hers in the particular way that things you have fought for remain yours. Frank and Dorothy sat on the same porch of the same ranch house and watched the last of an October sunset turn the sky the deep, impossible colors of the Kansas evening. Frank said, "Do you ever regret coming back?" Dorothy thought about the question the way she thought about real questions, completely and without hedging. "No," she said, "not for a single moment. Not even the first morning, when you came over the road and I was standing there." Dorothy looked at him sideways with the look she had refined over the years, part amusement and part genuine fondness, and part the specific warmth of a woman who has chosen the same person again and again across the entire scope of a shared life, and finds the choosing continually confirmed. "Especially not that morning," she said. He reached over and took her hand with the ease of someone who has been taking the same hand for a long time and finds it every time exactly where it was. And they sat together in the enormous Kansas evening with the whole of what they had built spread out around them, the children somewhere in the house behind them, the cattle quiet in the near dark, the cottonwood standing on Dorothy's parcel, visible in the failing light as a confident shape against the sky. The story of Dorothy Shelton was a story about a town that shamed her, and a man who made the wrong choice, and a woman who left and came back and stood her ground and won what she came for. But more than any of those things, it was a story about what happens when two people are honest with each other after a long time of not being honest, and about what kind of love grows in the soil of genuine reckoning, and about what it means to be waiting at the road not because you are owed anything, but because you know the person coming down it is the one your whole life has been building toward. The moon came up over the Kansas plain, full and white and enormous, the way the moon always came up in this country, without apology, taking up its full space in the sky as if it knew exactly what it was and where it belonged. Dorothy Shelton Donovan watched it rise, her hand in her husband's, the night around them warm and permanent and entirely, completely, and rightfully hers.